Ever wondered what students in the Middle Ages way back between 500 and 1500 AD actually learned? What kind of textbooks did they crack open? Get ready to have your mind blown by some wild subjects and even wilder ideas that filled the medieval classroom. Number 1. The art of healing, medieval style. Imagine a world where your doctor diagnoses you not by looking at your lab results, but by checking the stars and the color of your phlegm. Welcome to medieval medicine, a field where the ultimate textbook was often a collection of ancient wisdom, folk remedies, and a strong dose of what we would now call superstition. Students pored over texts like the Articella, a foundational collection of medical treatises which included works by Hippocrates and Galen, translated and commented on over centuries. But here is the shocker. These weren't just dusty old scrolls. They were the cutting-edge science of their time, shaping how life and death were understood. One of the biggest ideas in these textbooks was the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Medieval students learned that these four liquids flowing through your body determined everything about you: your personality, your health, even your mood. If you were too sanguine, you had too much blood and might be cheerful and optimistic. Too melancholic, you had an excess of black bile, leading to sadness and introspection. Illness was simply an imbalance of these humors. The goal of any treatment wasn't to fight a specific disease, as we think of it today, but to restore the body's natural balance. A physician's first task, as taught in these texts, was to observe the patient's complexion, pulse, urine, and even stool, all interpreted through the lens of humoral theory. A urine wheel, a common illustration in medical manuscripts, allowed students to match the color and clarity of urine to specific humoral imbalances, indicating ailments from fever to stomach upset. This detailed examination of external bodily signs, combined with an understanding of the patient's innate temperament, was central to their diagnostic process. Treatise from the medical school of Salerno, a renowned center of learning in southern Italy, might explain how a patient with a hot and dry temperament would be more prone to illnesses associated with yellow bile, such as fevers or jaundice. So how did they fix these imbalances? Medieval medical textbooks offered a wild array of remedies. Bloodletting was incredibly common. If you had too much blood, the obvious solution was to remove some. Students learned the precise veins to open, the specific days and times to perform the procedure, often dictated by astrological charts, and even the amount of blood to drain, which could be a significant amount for a weakening patient. Text known as the Regimen of Health of Salerno, a popular guide for both physicians and lay people, provided advice on when and how to bleed a patient, noting that spring was a good time to purge excess blood to prevent future illness. Purging through strong laxatives and emetics, or sweating in hot baths, were also common methods to expel bad humors from the body, often combined with specific diets or lifestyle changes. The physician, armed with these texts, acted as a regulator, carefully guiding the patient back to a state of equilibrium. Herbal medicine was another huge part of the curriculum. Students learned about hundreds of plants and their supposed properties. A medieval pharmacopoeia might list remedies for everything from a fever to a broken bone, often mixing practical knowledge with spiritual beliefs. For example, the mandrake root, with its human-like shape, was believed to have powerful pain-relieving and even magical properties, as detailed in herbals circulating from the 10th century onwards. The dosage and preparation were crucial, but the underlying mechanisms were often explained through sympathetic magic. The doctrine of signatures, where a plant's appearance hinted at its medicinal use or divine intervention rather than chemical compounds. A manuscript from the 12th century might instruct a student to mix powdered unicorn horn with various herbs to combat poison, despite the obvious difficulty in acquiring the primary ingredient, touting the blend of the known and the mythical. Recipes for compound medicines could be incredibly complex, requiring dozens of ingredients, some common, some exotic, to be prepared over long periods. Perhaps one of the most shocking elements for a modern student would be the role of astrology. For medieval physicians, the heavens were deeply connected to the human body. Each zodiac sign ruled a specific part of the body, and the position of planets could influence the humors. A student training to be a doctor would spend significant time studying celestial charts, learning to calculate the moon's phase and the planetary positions before prescribing a treatment or performing a procedure. Performing a bloodletting on a day when the moon was in the sign of Aries, which ruled the head, might be considered dangerous if the ailment was also related to the head, according to treatises like the Tetrabiblos of Ptolemy, a foundational astrological text widely studied. A skilled physician, it was taught, needed to be as much an astrologer as a healer, understanding the cosmic influences on human health. Calendars and almanacs for physicians often included detailed astrological information, marking auspicious and inauspicious days for treatments. Anatomy was also part of the curriculum, but it was very different from modern studies. Dissection of human bodies was rare and often prohibited, especially in the early medieval period. Most anatomical knowledge came from ancient Greek and Roman texts, particularly those of Galen, who had dissected animals but made assumptions about human anatomy. Medieval diagrams of the human body were often schematic and highly generalized, not detailed representations from direct observation. These diagrams, sometimes depicting idealized figures with internal organs placed symbolically rather than accurately, served more as mnemonic aids for understanding humoral theory or astrological inference. For instance, a diagram from a 14th century surgical text might show the wound man with various injuries and the corresponding remedies, but the internal anatomy would be simplified to suit the text's purpose, often prototyping for the anticicle or theological understanding. Students would memorize lists of bones and organs, but their understanding of their intricate functions was limited by the lack of direct observation. Beyond physical remedies, medieval medicine also acknowledged the spiritual dimension of illness. Sickness could be seen as a divine punishment for sin, or the result of demonic influence. Therefore, prayer, pilgrimages, and the intervention of saints were often considered as important components of healing as any herbal potion or bloodletting. A patient might seek treatment from a physician, but also make a vow to a saint or visit a holy shrine. This integrated approach meant that a medical textbook might discuss the importance of a patient's spiritual state alongside dietary advice. The physician's role extended to the moral and spiritual well-being of the patient, sometimes advising confession or repentance as part of a holistic cure. Public health, as we understand it, was largely absent, with outbreaks of plague or other widespread diseases often attributed to divine wrath or planetary conjunctions, as recorded in chronicles from the 14th century during the Black Death. The focus was less on understanding the precise mechanisms of disease or the intricate structure of the body, and more on classifying symptoms, identifying humoral imbalances, and prescribing treatments based on established ancient authority. A medical student's main goal was to master the ancient texts, memorize lists of remedies, and understand the complex interplay of humors and celestial bodies. While some practical skills like wound care, setting broken bones, and even simple surgical procedures like cataract removal were taught, the overarching framework of medieval medicine was rooted in a holistic view of the human being connected to the cosmos, rather than a microscopic view of pathogens or cellular structures. This approach, while profoundly different from today's scientific medicine, represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and practice within its own context, providing comfort and care in a world with very different understandings of the human body and its ailments. The daily life of a medieval physician, guided by these very textbooks, was one of constant observation, interpretation, and intervention, all within a worldview that connected the microcosm of the human body to the macrocosm of the universe. Number 2. the fantastic menagerie of bestiaries. Imagine opening your biology textbook only to find pages filled with detailed descriptions of unicorns, griffins, and phoenixes right alongside lions, elephants, and wolves. Even stranger, every single animal, real or imaginary, comes with a moral or religious lesson attached. Welcome to the world of the medieval bestiary, one of the most popular and captivating textbooks of its time. These were not just scientific guides. They were allegorical encyclopedias of the natural world, designed to teach about God, morality, and human behavior through the lens of creation. The roots of the medieval bestiary lie in a much older Greek text called the Physiologus, written sometime between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD. This original text described about 50 animals, stones, and plants, each followed by a Christian moral interpretation. Over the centuries, as the Physiologus was translated into Latin and expanded, it grew into the elaborate illuminated manuscripts we know as bestiaries. A student in the Middle Ages would have studied these texts not to learn about biological classifications or habitats, but to understand the symbolic meaning behind each creature. For example, the lion was often depicted as a symbol of Christ because it was said to erase its footprints with its tail, just as Christ concealed his divinity. It was also believed that lion cubs were born dead and brought to life on the 3rd day by their father's roar, mirroring the resurrection. A common bestiary might feature vivid illustrations of this very scene, reinforcing the allegorical lesson. Students would memorize these connections, using them in sermons, poems, or general conversations to explain spiritual truths. One of the most surprising aspects for a modern student would be the complete lack of empirical observation. Bestiary authors rarely, if ever, observed the animals they wrote about directly. Their knowledge came from ancient texts, travelers' tales, and pure imagination. This led to fascinating, if wildly inaccurate, descriptions. Take the elephant. Bestiaries often described elephants as having no joints in their legs, meaning they could not lie down, and had to sleep leaning against a tree. Poachers, it was said, would then saw through the tree, causing the elephant to fall and be captured. This incredible detail, found in texts from the 12th and 13th centuries, speaks volumes about the medieval approach to natural history. Students were not taught to question these descriptions based on real-world evidence. They were taught to accept them as part of a larger, divinely ordered world where every detail served a purpose. Another popular entry was the hydrus, a small snake-like creature believed to enter the mouth of a crocodile while it slept, eat its way out of its belly, and thus destroy it. This was interpreted as Christ's triumph over Satan, a vivid image for teaching good over evil. Then there were the mythical creatures, treated with the same seriousness as real ones. The unicorn, a pure white horse-like creature with a single horn, was a staple of every bestiary. It was believed to be so swift and fierce that it could only be captured by a virgin, symbolizing purity and Christ's incarnation. The griffin, a majestic beast with the head and wings of an eagle and the body of a lion, was often associated with strength and vigilance, frequently appearing in heraldry and as guardians in literature. The phoenix, a bird that would burn itself to ashes every 500 years and then rise anew, was a powerful symbol of resurrection and eternal life, widely referenced in religious texts and art. These creatures were not seen as mere fantasy. They were considered part of God's creation, just as real as a sparrow or a cow, and each carried a profound spiritual message. A student would learn the precise characteristics of each mythical beast, not for zoological identification, but for its rich symbolic meaning and how it illuminated biblical passages or moral principles. Beyond individual animals, bestiaries taught a particular worldview. The medieval world was seen as a book written by God, and every creature was a word or a sentence in that book carrying a hidden meaning. The act of studying animals was, therefore, an active theological contemplation. For example, the beaver was described as biting off its testicles when pursued by hunters to escape, since its testicles were valued for medicinal purposes. This act was interpreted as a moral lesson for humans, to cast away their sins or vices when pursued by spiritual enemies, just as the beaver sacrifices a part of itself for its safety. Such explicit moralizations followed almost every animal entry, transforming a natural history lesson into a sermon. A manuscript from Canterbury from around 1170 includes detailed sections on the ant lion, a creature described as having the face of a lion and the body of an ant, unable to eat either meat or grain, thus perishing from starvation, a symbol of those who are indecisive or hypocritical in their faith, unable to choose between different paths. The descriptions often began with details about the animal's physical appearance and habits, then swiftly moved to its allegorical interpretation, sometimes citing scripture to bolster the connection. The illustrations in bestiaries were also a key teaching tool. Richly illuminated manuscripts, often commissioned by wealthy patrons, featured vibrant, stylized images of the animals. These images were not meant to be photographically accurate. Instead, they emphasized the symbolic attributes of the creature, often depicting the very scene of its moral lesson. A leopard might be shown with distinctive spots, but its body might be elongated or its posture exaggerated to convey its ferocity or cunning. The visual element was crucial for memorization and understanding, helping students to associate the animal with its specific moral lesson and visualize the theological truth. A medieval student might spend hours copying these images into their own notebooks, further internalizing the lessons and preparing for their own future roles as preachers or scholars. These texts were not mass-produced like modern textbooks. Each was a unique, often hand-crafted work of art, making their study a privilege. The function of bestiaries went beyond the classroom. They were used by preachers to gather material for sermons, providing vivid and memorable examples from the natural world to illustrate Christian doctrine. Poets and storytellers drew inspiration from their tales, incorporating bestiary lore into epics and romances. Artists consulted them for accurate, by medieval standards, depictions of creatures in church carvings, tapestries, and stained glass, ensuring that the symbolic messages were widely understood by the general populace. They reflected a world where knowledge was integrated, where science, theology, and art were not separate disciplines, but intertwined ways of understanding existence. The shocking part for a modern student might be the complete lack of a clear distinction between the real and the imagined, the scientific and the symbolic. In the medieval mind, everything had a purpose and a meaning, and the natural world was a constant reminder of divine truths. A bestiary wasn't a factual guide to biology, it was a guide to living a virtuous life, revealed through the miraculous diversity of creation. The focus was not on how animals evolved or their ecological roles, but on what they represented in the grand cosmic scheme, a testament to God's wondrous design and a rich source of moral instruction for all who encountered them. Number 3. Stargazing for your soul. Medieval astrology and astronomy. What if your math class included calculating your destiny, and your physics lecture involved understanding the precise influence of the moon on your personality? For medieval students, particularly those in universities, astronomy and astrology were not just related fields. They were often seen as two sides of the same celestial coin. Textbooks in this realm, ranging from simplified introductory guides to complex treatises like Ptolemy's Almagest and Tetrabiblos, taught students about the structure of the cosmos and its profound impact on life on Earth. The shocking part. A modern student might be surprised by how deeply intertwined scientific observation was with the belief in planetary influence on human affairs. At the heart of medieval astronomy was the geocentric model of the universe. Forget everything you learned about the Earth. revolving around the sun. For a medieval scholar, the Earth was the stationary center of the cosmos, with the moon, sun, and other planets along with a sphere of fixed stars, all revolving around it in perfect concentric circles. This model, largely derived from ancient Greek thinkers like Aristotle and Ptolemy, was not just a scientific theory. It aligned perfectly with theological beliefs that placed humanity at the center of God's creation. Text from the 12th century often included elaborate diagrams of these nested spheres, sometimes with angels pushing them or celestial bodies fixed upon them, emphasizing the divine order. Students spent countless hours memorizing the names of the planets and constellations, their orbits, and the intricate system of epicycles and deferents that Ptolemy devised to explain the seemingly irregular movements of the planets. This complex mathematical framework was taught as the definitive understanding of the universe. But knowing where the planets were was only half the story. Understanding what they meant was just as, if not more important. This is where astrology came in. Medieval universities widely taught astrology as a legitimate and essential discipline. It wasn't about fortune-telling in a casual sense. It was about understanding the natural influences of the celestial bodies on the sublunary world, the world below the moon, which was seen as mutable and imperfect, unlike the perfect and unchanging heavens. Every planet, every zodiac sign, every house in an astrological chart had specific qualities and influences. For instance, Mars was associated with war, anger, and heat, while Venus was linked to love, beauty, and harmony. A student would learn how to cast a natal chart, calculating the precise positions of the planets at the moment of a person's birth to determine their inherent temperament, strengths, and weaknesses. Treatises like Abul Mashar's Introductorium in Astronomum, translated into Latin in the 12th century, became essential reading for aspiring astrologers and scholars. The applications of this knowledge were vast and practical for the medieval world. Astrology was used in medicine, as mentioned earlier, to determine the best times for treatments, surgeries, or administering medicines, ensuring that the celestial influences were favorable. Kings and princes employed court astrologers to advise them on matters of state, from declaring war to planning marriages, ensuring auspicious timing. Building projects, agricultural planting, and even travel plans could be guided by astrological considerations. A farmer might consult an almanac to find the best day, based on the moon's phase, to sow his crops for a bountiful harvest. These were not fringe beliefs. They were integral to the decision-making processes of society, taught and reinforced in the most esteemed academic institutions. Students learned to make complex mathematical calculations to construct these charts. They would use instruments like the astrolabe, a sophisticated device for measuring the positions of celestial bodies and solving problems related to time and location. Mastering the astrolabe, as described in guides like that by Geoffrey Chaucer, was a rite of passage for any student of astronomy. They also studied tables of planetary movements, often compiled over centuries, to predict future conjunctions or eclipses. Precision required for these calculations was immense, combining geometry, trigonometry, and arithmetic skills that would be taught alongside the more philosophical aspects of celestial influence. The mathematical rigor involved would surprise anyone who assumes medieval science was primitive. Curriculum often included different branches of astrology. Natural astrology focused on general predictions like weather patterns, epidemics, or harvests, based on celestial phenomena. Judicial astrology dealt with specific predictions for individuals or events, based on birth charts, or the moment an event began. While some church authorities expressed caution or even condemnation towards judicial astrology for infringing on free will or divine providence, its practice remained widespread and academically accepted. Scholars debated the extent to which the stars compelled human actions versus merely inclining them, a philosophical discussion woven into the study of the heavens. The concept of aspects between planets was also a key part of the study. when two planets formed a particular angle to each other from the Earth's perspective, such as a trine, 120 degrees, or a square, 90 degrees. These alignments were believed to have specific influences. A harmonious aspect, like a trine, might bring good fortune, while a challenging aspect, like a square, could signify obstacles or conflicts. Understanding and interpreting these complex relationships was a core skill for any aspiring astrologer. Treatises like those by Abraham ibn Ezra from the 12th century detailed the precise mathematical methods for calculating these aspects and their interpretation. Ultimately, medieval astronomy and astrology were deeply rooted in a worldview where the cosmos was alive, intelligent, and intimately connected to human existence. The stars were not distant indifferent gas balls. They were divine messengers, powerful influences, and a source of profound knowledge about the world and oneself. A medieval student's cosmic education was not about detached scientific inquiry alone. It was about understanding the grand interconnected tapestry of existence where every celestial movement resonated with life on Earth. The shocking element for modern students is this seamless blend of what we now consider distinct disciplines. Science, mathematics, philosophy, and divination, all wrapped into one comprehensive understanding of the universe. Number 4. The Philosopher's Stone and Beyond. The Allure of Alchemy. Imagine a science class where the main goal is to turn lead into gold, create a potion for eternal life, or even craft a miniature human being. Welcome to the captivating, secretive, and often baffling world of medieval alchemy. For many medieval scholars, alchemists, and even some religious figures, alchemy was far more than just proto-chemistry. It was a profound philosophical system, a spiritual quest, and a deeply practical art, all wrapped into one. Textbooks on alchemy, often shrouded in cryptic language and symbolic imagery, would deeply shock a modern student accustomed to clear, testable hypotheses. Alchemy's roots stretch back to ancient Egypt and Greece, later flourishing in the Islamic world before arriving in medieval Europe around the 12th century through translations of Arabic texts. Figures like Pseudo-Geber, a Latin author writing under the name of an earlier Arabic alchemist, Jabir ibn Hayyan, and Roger Bacon wrote influential treatises that circulated widely. Core belief, as taught in these texts, was that all metals were essentially the same substance at different stages of development. Lead, for example, was simply immature gold. Through various processes, the alchemist aimed to perfect these base metals, transforming them into the noble metal gold. This process, known as chrysopeia, was not just a chemical reaction. It was seen as mirroring the natural process of creation, accelerated by human art. The methods described in alchemical texts were complex and dangerous, involving furnaces, retorts, distillation, calcination, and sublimation. Students would learn about specific substances, called elixirs or the Philosopher's Stone, which were believed to facilitate these transmutations. The Philosopher's Stone was not a simple rock, but a legendary substance of immense power, capable of perfecting all imperfect things. Texts like Rosarium Philosophorum, the Rosary of the Philosophers, a highly influential alchemical anthology from the 14th century, detailed the stages of the alchemical process, often through a series of symbolic images. These stages included the nigredo, blackening or putrefaction, albedo, whitening or purification, and rubedo, reddening or perfection, each representing a step in the transformation of matter. A modern student would find the lack of precise chemical formulas replaced by allegories of death and rebirth utterly bewildering. What makes alchemy truly shocking for modern sensibilities is its spiritual dimension. For many practitioners, the physical transformation of metals was a metaphor for the spiritual purification of the alchemist themselves. Quest for gold was often intertwined with a quest for inner enlightenment, a return to a state of pristine purity. the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, symbolized not only material perfection, but also spiritual redemption and the attainment of gnosis. Alchemical texts would frequently discuss the soul, the divine, and the microcosm and macrocosm, connecting the alchemist's work to the grand scheme of creation. This blend of metallurgy, mysticism, and philosophy meant that an alchemical textbook might contain instructions for laboratory experiments, alongside meditations on the nature of God. The language used in these textbooks was deliberately obscure and symbolic, often to protect trade secrets, to prevent dangerous experiments by the uninitiated, or simply because alchemists believed the true nature of things could only be conveyed through allegory. The green lion might refer to vitriol, sulfuric acid, and the red king to sulfur, while marriage between elements implied chemical combination. A student deciphering these texts needed not only chemical knowledge, but also a deep understanding of classical mythology, Christian theology, and philosophical concepts. For example, a treatise attributed to the famous English alchemist George Ripley, The Compound of Alchemy from the 15th century, describes the entire alchemical process using allegories of the human body and spiritual union. The difficulty of interpretation made these texts both frustrating and endlessly fascinating. Beyond the grand goal of making gold, alchemy also had practical applications that might surprise a modern student. Alchemists developed techniques for distillation, sublimation, and calcination that contributed to later chemical processes. They produced pigments for painting, experimented with glassmaking, created various alloys, and even sought to synthesize new medicines. Paracelsus, a later alchemist and physician from the Renaissance, championed iatrochemistry, integrating chemical preparations into medicine, building upon centuries of alchemical experimentation. While their theories about elemental transformation were incorrect, their practical innovations in laboratory techniques and the handling of substances laid foundational groundwork for chemistry and pharmacy. A medieval alchemical workshop guided by these texts would have been a buzzing hub of experimental activity, full of furnaces, strange vessels, and pungent fumes. The pursuit of the elixir of life, a universal panacea, or a potion for immortality, was another central aim of alchemy. Texts described how this elixir, often a liquid form of the philosopher's stone, could cure all diseases and extend life indefinitely. This was not just a pipe dream. It was a serious area of research for many alchemists, driven by the desire to overcome human mortality and suffering. The search for this elixir blended medical aspiration with spiritual yearning, reflecting a medieval worldview where the boundaries between the physical and the metaphysical were far more fluid than today. Constant failure to achieve transmutation or create the elixir of life did not necessarily disprove alchemy in the medieval mind. Rather, failures were often attributed to the alchemist's lack of purity, insufficient understanding of the ancient texts, or improper technique. The secret nature of the knowledge, passed down through cryptic writings, ensured that the quest continued for centuries. A modern student, used to reproducible results and clear methodologies, would likely be baffled by a system where success was tied to spiritual enlightenment as much as scientific rigor. Medieval alchemy was a rich tapestry of practical experimentation, profound philosophical speculation, and deeply held spiritual beliefs. A testament to a time when the search for knowledge was a holistic pursuit, connecting matter to spirit in ways we can barely comprehend. Number 5. Disputing your way to truth. The art of logic and philosophy. Imagine a classroom where the main activity isn't listening to a lecture or taking notes, but engaging in hours-long, highly formalized debates about incredibly abstract questions. Welcome to the core of medieval university education. Logic and philosophy, often intertwined with theology. Textbooks here were primarily the works of Aristotle, translated and commented upon, alongside influential medieval thinkers like Peter Abelard, Thomas Aquinas, and John Duns Scotus. A modern student would be absolutely floored by the sheer intensity of the logical exercises and the types of questions medieval scholars spent their lives arguing over. The foundation of this education was logic specifically, Aristotelian logic. Students began with texts like Aristotle's Organon, translated as instrument or tool, which detailed the rules of valid reasoning, syllogisms, fallacies, and categorical propositions. They learned how to construct arguments rigorously, how to identify flaws in an opponent's reasoning, and how to define terms precisely. A student would spend years mastering the different figures and moods of syllogisms. For example, understanding that all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, is a valid deduction, and being able to identify hundreds of variations. This wasn't just an academic exercise. Logic was the essential tool for all other forms of knowledge, especially theology and law. As taught in the University of Paris in the 13th century, mastering logic was the gateway to true understanding. Teaching method was predominantly the disputatio, a formal public debate. A master would propose a question, often a contradiction or a difficult concept, and students would argue for and against it, citing authorities, using logical deductions and raising objections. The master would then summarize the arguments and provide a definitive answer known as the determinatio. This system was designed to train students in critical thinking, rigorous argumentation, and the ability to reconcile apparent contradictions. Texts like Peter Abelard's Sic et Non, Yes and No, from the 12th century, exemplified this method by presenting conflicting statements from church fathers on various theological issues, forcing students to engage in deep intellectual reconciliation. The shocking part for a modern student might be the complete lack of individual expression in favor of highly structured communal intellectual combat. Questions themselves could seem incredibly abstract to us. Debates raged over universals. Do general concepts like humanity or redness exist independently of individual humans or red objects, or are they merely names we apply to things? This was not just a philosophical parlor game. It had profound theological implications for concepts like the Trinity or the nature of sacraments. Another famous, often caricatured question was about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. While this specific question is likely apocryphal, it represents the kind of highly refined, almost hyperlogical discussions that medieval scholars engaged in, seeking to explore the limits of logical possibility and metaphysical reality. They were not trying to count angels. They were exploring the nature of incorporeal substances and spatial dimensions. Philosophy, particularly metaphysics and natural philosophy, what we would call science, was studied through the lens of Aristotle. His works on physics, ethics, and the soul were central. Medieval scholars adapted Aristotle's ideas to fit within a Christian framework, leading to a rich intellectual tradition known as scholasticism. Thomas Aquinas' monumental Summa Theologica is a prime example of this, structured as a series of questions, objections, and responses, mirroring the disputatio method. Students would memorize passages, analyze arguments, and write detailed commentaries on these foundational texts. The goal was not to innovate new theories, but to understand and synthesize existing knowledge, reconciling faith and reason. The focus on authority was immense. Arguments were often strengthened by citing esteemed sources: Aristotle, Plato, Augustine, the Bible, church fathers. A student would spend years learning to identify and correctly quote these authorities. Originality, in the modern sense, was less valued than the ability to synthesize and harmonize diverse authoritative opinions using logical rigor. This approach would seem stifling to many modern students who are encouraged to develop unique perspectives. Yet, within this framework, medieval scholars developed incredibly sophisticated arguments and subtle distinctions. Ethics and moral philosophy were also deeply integrated into this curriculum. Students studied Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, examining concepts of virtue, happiness, and the good life, always interpreted through a Christian lens. They learned about the nature of sin, the cardinal virtues, and the relationship between human law and divine law. This wasn't just theoretical. It was about shaping virtuous individuals and a just society. The medieval philosophical textbook was less about a single book and more about a rigorous method of inquiry, a shared body of authoritative texts, and a community dedicated to intellectual disputation. The shocking element for modern students is perhaps the idea that abstract, logical argument could be the most thrilling and important activity, a path to not only academic success but also spiritual enlightenment. It was a world where words and ideas held immense power, and the ability to wield them logically was the ultimate skill. The air in a medieval university hall filled with the clang of bells and the murmur of Latin would often be punctuated by the sharp retorts and carefully constructed arguments of students perfecting their craft. Number 6, beyond counting your coins. Medieval arithmetic and geometry. What if your math class focused more on the cosmic harmony of numbers than on practical calculations, or explored geometry as a pathway to understanding divine design rather than building bridges? For medieval students, especially those pursuing a higher education in the liberal arts, arithmetic and geometry were not just tools for commerce or construction. They were profound intellectual disciplines, part of the quadrivium, the four paths of learning, aimed at understanding the order and beauty of God's creation. The textbooks, primarily derived from ancient Greek thinkers like Nicomachus and Euclid, often presented mathematical concepts in ways that would deeply surprise modern students. Medieval arithmetic was largely based on the work of Nicomachus of Gerasa, whose Introduction to Arithmetic, translated into Latin by Boethius in the 6th century, was a cornerstone text. This wasn't a textbook for doing sums quickly or calculating compound interest. Instead, it explored the philosophical properties of numbers, odd and even, prime and composite perfect numbers, and ratios. Numbers were not just quantities. They were seen as inherent principles of existence, reflecting the divine mind that ordered the universe. Students learned about the relationships between numbers, how they form sequences, and their symbolic meanings within a theological framework. For example, the number 7, found in the days of creation and the 7 liberal arts, held significant symbolic power as a representation of perfection or completeness. Curriculum emphasized abstract understanding and contemplation over practical computation, aiming to train the mind in logical and orderly thought. The shocking part for a modern student is how little emphasis was placed on everyday calculation for much of the period. While the abacus was used for commercial transactions by merchants and clerks, the academic study of arithmetic was much more theoretical and conceptual. The decimal system and Arabic numerals with their place value and zero only gradually came into widespread use in Europe from the 12th century onwards, often through texts like Leonardo Fotpame's Liber Abaci, Book of Calculation, from 1202, which introduced these advanced methods from the Islamic world. Before that, Roman numerals were common, making complex multiplication and division much more cumbersome and requiring specialized techniques. So students in earlier centuries might spend significant time learning the philosophy of numbers and their cosmic significance, but struggle with a basic multiplication problem that a 5th grader could solve in seconds today. Their mathematical strength was in theoretical understanding, not computational speed. Geometry, too, was approached from a philosophical standpoint. Euclid's Elements, perhaps the most influential mathematics textbook of all time, was meticulously studied. Students learned about points, lines, planes, angles, and shapes, not just as abstract forms, but as expressions of divine order and the foundational structure of the cosmos. The elegance of Euclidean proofs, building complex theorems from simple axioms through logical deduction, was seen as a testament to the rationality and inherent beauty of God's universe. A medieval geometry class would involve drawing precise diagrams with compass and straightedge, understanding the logical progression of proofs, and memorizing propositions. This knowledge was applied not just to practical tasks like architecture or surveying, though these applications existed, but primarily to understanding the structure of the cosmos and the harmonic or astronomy. For example, understanding the properties of spheres was crucial for comprehending the geocentric model of the universe. The profound connection between arithmetic, geometry, and other disciplines was a key feature of medieval learning. The quadrivium also included music, harmonics, and astronomy. Music was understood mathematically through the precise ratios of musical intervals, a concept derived from Pythagoras. Students would study how simple whole number ratios created consonant harmonies, believed to reflect the divine harmony of the spheres, a theoretical cosmic music produced by the movements of planets. For example, a student might learn that the perfect fifth musical interval corresponds to a 3:2 ratio, and this ratio was seen as reflecting a fundamental cosmic truth connecting sound to universal order. Astronomy, as previously discussed, relied heavily on geometry for understanding celestial movements and on arithmetic for calculating planetary positions and astrological influences. The motion of the planets was described with intricate geometric models, and their speeds and distances were calculated using complex arithmetic, all contributing to a complete, divinely ordered worldview. The liberal arts were integrated into a holistic system of knowledge, where mathematics was considered the purest language of the universe, revealing its underlying structure. Teaching methods often involved copying texts by hand, memorizing proofs, and listening to lectures that expounded on the philosophical and theological implications of the mathematical concepts. Students would work through problems, but the emphasis was less on finding numerical answers to practical dilemmas, and more on understanding the underlying principles and their universal significance. Mathematical diagrams, often hand-drawn in exquisite detail in manuscripts, were essential for visualizing abstract concepts, helping students grasp the beauty and logic of the numerical relationships. A medieval geometry lesson might focus on proving a theorem about circles with the unspoken understanding that circles represented divine perfection and infinity. While practical applications of mathematics, especially for commerce, engineering, and architecture, did become more prominent in the later Middle Ages, particularly outside university settings. For much of the period, mathematics was primarily seen as a theoretical discipline that trained the mind and provided insight into divine order. The shock for modern students lies in this fundamental difference in purpose. Today, mathematics is largely seen as a practical tool for solving real-world problems, developing technology, and advancing empirical science. In the medieval period, it was a gateway to understanding the divine rationality embedded in the cosmos, a pathway to contemplating abstract truths about existence. It was a discipline that elevated the mind, enabling scholars to appreciate the intricate design of the universe, whether calculating the angles of a cathedral vault, the ratios of musical harmony, or the paths of the wandering stars, all illuminated by the unchanging principles of number and form. Number 7. Mastering the tongue. Grammar and rhetoric for a Latin world. Ever think learning grammar is just about remembering rules for a test? Imagine a time when mastering grammar and rhetoric was not just about sounding smart, but about holding the keys to all knowledge, power, and even salvation. In the medieval world, especially in the early and high Middle Ages, textbooks on grammar and rhetoric were foundational. They formed the core of the trivium, the three paths of learning, along with logic, and were essential for anyone hoping to pursue a serious education, whether in theology, law, or administration. A modern student, used to a diverse curriculum in their native language, would be absolutely shocked by the sheer intensity and singular focus on Latin grammar and the art of persuasion. The undisputed king of medieval grammar textbooks was Aelius Donatus's Ars Minor, the Lesser Art, written in the 4th century AD. This short, simple text, structured as a question and answer dialogue, laid out the 8 parts of speech: noun, pronoun, verb, adverb, participle, conjunction, preposition, interjection, and their various inflections. It was so ubiquitous that Donat became a generic term for a grammar primer. Students, often beginning as young as 7, would learn this text by rote memorization. They would chant declensions of nouns, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, vocative, and conjugations of verbs, present imperfect, future perfect, pluperfect, future perfect, until they could recite them perfectly. This wasn't just about understanding sentences. It was about internalizing the very structure of the Latin language, recognizing its patterns, and being able to apply them automatically. Another crucial text was Priscian's Institutiones Grammaticae, Grammatical Institutes, a much longer and more complex treatise that detailed Latin grammar in exhaustive detail across 18 books, serving as the advanced textbook for university-level study. Priscian's work became the standard against which all Latin writing was measured. The shock factor for a modern student is twofold. First, the language itself. Latin was not a native tongue for most medieval students. They were learning what was essentially a foreign language, but one that was the universal language of scholarship, government, and the church across Western Europe. All important texts, from philosophical treatises to legal documents to religious texts and scientific works, were in Latin. To access knowledge, to communicate effectively with scholars from other lands, and to participate in the learned world, mastering Latin was absolutely non-negotiable. It was the internet of its time, connecting everyone in the intellectual sphere, and without it, one was intellectually isolated. Different regions spoke different vernaculars, but Latin provided a common ground for the educated elite. Second, the purpose of grammar was far grander than we typically conceive it. It wasn't just about correct spelling or sentence structure for clarity in daily communication. For medieval scholars, grammar was the key to unlocking the wisdom of the ancients and, more importantly, to understanding divine scripture. The precise meaning of a biblical verse, a theological argument, or a legal clause could hinge on a single word's declension, a verb's tense, or the placement of a particle. As one medieval scholar might have taught, understanding the modus significandi, mode of signifying of words, was to understand the very truth they conveyed. Grammar was seen as the first liberal art because it taught the proper use of language, which in turn was the vehicle for all rational thought and clear communication. Students would not only parse sentences but also meticulously analyze the grammatical structures of authoritative texts like the Vulgate Bible, seeking deeper theological insights and uncovering subtle nuances of meaning that informed their understanding of God's Word. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech and writing, came next in the trivium building upon the rigorous foundation of grammar and closely linked with logic. Students learned how to construct compelling arguments, how to adorn their speech with figures of rhetoric like metaphor, allegory, hyperbole, antithesis, and personification, and how to sway an audience through logical reasoning and emotional appeal. Textbooks drew heavily from ancient Roman masters, like Cicero's De Endentini and Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria, both highly influential in outlining the principles of effective communication. Students would study the 5 canons of rhetoric: invention, finding suitable arguments; arrangement, organizing those arguments effectively; style, choosing appropriate words and figures; memory, recalling material for delivery; and delivery, speaking or presenting effectively. They would practice writing orations, sermons, and legal pleas, honing their ability to articulate complex ideas clearly and convincingly. The medieval context for rhetoric would also surprise a modern student. While we might think of rhetoric primarily in terms of political speeches or advertising today, in the Middle Ages, its primary applications were in sermons preached from pulpits, legal arguments presented in ecclesiastical or secular courts, and official correspondence between powerful figures. A skilled rhetorician could convince a bishop to adopt a certain policy, win a complex legal case for a client, or inspire a congregation to greater devotion. The ability to express oneself eloquently and persuasively was a highly valued skill, crucial for anyone in a position of authority, influence, or teaching. A royal clerk, for example, would have used advanced rhetorical techniques to draft letters and charters that conveyed the king's authority and intentions clearly and effectively, often using carefully chosen words to assert power or make subtle demands. Curriculum might also involve detailed study of letter writing, ars dictaminis, a highly formalized and rhetorical art that became particularly important from the 11th century onwards. Learning the proper salutations, introductions, statements, and conclusions for different types of letters, from a formal plea to a diplomatic communique, from a simple request to a weighty decree, was crucial for administrative and ecclesiastical roles. Textbooks on ars dictaminis provided model letters for various occasions, and detailed instructions on how to tailor them to the specific recipient and purpose, emphasizing clarity, conciseness, and persuasive power. This was a practical application of rhetorical principles directly relevant to careers in the church royal courts or growing urban centers where written communication was increasingly vital. Memorization played an enormous role. Not just grammar rules, but vast passages of classical texts, theological arguments, and model speeches were committed to memory. This was in part because books were rare and expensive, so a well-educated person needed to carry much of their knowledge in their head. The mind was seen as a library, and grammar provided the filing system, rhetoric, the narrative structure. The discipline of rote learning was thought to sharpen the mind and embed knowledge deeply. For medieval students, grammar and rhetoric were not separate, dusty subjects. They were alive and vital. They were the very means by which knowledge was preserved, understood, and transmitted. They shaped not just how one spoke or wrote, but how one thought and reasoned, how one engaged with the world of ideas. The depth of engagement with language, the precision demanded, and the profound implications of its mastery for all aspects of medieval life, from solity to daily administration, from scholarly debate to spiritual contemplation, would leave any modern student astonished at the centrality of these textbooks in their education.